There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in at this age. Not peaceful, exactly. More like the quiet after something ends, after the last guest leaves, after the last door closes. You sit in it, and you realize it wasn't supposed to feel this way.
My name is Harold Whitmore. I'm 78 years old, and I'm sitting in the same chair I've sat in for the last 11 years, in an apartment that holds 2 people's worth of furniture and only one person's footsteps. I want to talk about something I've never said out loud, not to my son, not to my doctor, not to the men I used to have coffee with on Tuesday mornings before, one by one, they stopped coming. I want to talk about what it felt like to be 62 years old and suddenly available, and how I wasted what time I had left to not be alone. My wife, Carol, passed in the spring of 2009. We'd been married 34 years. Not a perfect marriage, not a storybook. We argued about money in our 40s, about the kids in our 50s, about nothing and everything in between. But she was there. Every morning she was there. The sound of her moving through the kitchen, the specific way she exhaled when she was reading something that bothered her. When she died, I didn't just lose her. I lost the whole architecture of my days. People don't tell you that. They say you'll grieve, and then you'll heal, and then slowly life will find its shape again. And some of that is true. The grief does change. But the shape of a life built around another person, that doesn't just repair itself. You have to rebuild it deliberately. And I didn't know that. I genuinely didn't understand that was what needed to happen. So I waited. I waited for something to return that was never coming back. The first year, that was understandable. Even the second. I kept myself busy the way widowers' men do. I visited my son in Portland 3 times. I painted the hallway. I joined a Thursday night card game with men from the neighborhood who smelled like the same aftershave they'd worn since 1987. I told myself I was doing fine, and in a very narrow sense I was. I was surviving. I was eating. I was sleeping, mostly. I wasn't falling apart in any visible way. But I was receding. That's the only word I have for it now. I was slowly stepping back from my own life without realizing that's what I was doing. And when people, my sister, my son's wife, Linda, a woman from Carol's book club named Ruth, who had also lost her husband, when people gently suggested that maybe, one day, I might think about meeting someone, I felt something I can only describe now as a flinching. Not anger, not grief exactly, a flinching, like the very idea required a kind of courage I wasn't sure I still had. I was 64 when I first went to a dinner organized by a widowers group at the community center. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car for 11 minutes in the parking lot. I remember because I watched the clock. I told myself I'd go in at 7, then 7:02. Then I thought, if I'm not inside by 7:15, I'll just go home and that will be that. I went inside at 7:13. There were 9 people at a long table, 4 men, 5 women. Someone had put a small flower arrangement in the center that looked like it came from a grocery store. There was decaf coffee and a plate of shortbread cookies, and the kind of careful, polite conversation that people have when they're all quietly terrified. I sat next to a woman named Evelyn. She was 61. She had silver hair she wore pulled back, and she laughed at something I said about the cookies, something not even particularly funny, and for about 40 seconds I felt like a person again. That feeling surprised me. It frightened me, if I'm honest. I didn't call her. She had written her number on a torn corner of a paper napkin and handed it to me when we were putting on our coats to leave. She'd smiled in a way that wasn't uncertain at all. She wasn't flinching. She was just open, simply, ordinarily open. And I put the number in my jacket pocket, and I drove home, and I sat in my chair, and I thought about Carol. Not with sadness, exactly. More like I was checking in with her, asking something silently I couldn't quite form into words. I never called Evelyn. The napkin stayed in that jacket for 4 months. I found it when I took the jacket to the dry cleaner. By then, I'd convinced myself it was too late, that too much time had passed, that she'd have moved on or assumed I wasn't interested. And besides, who was I to think that I could just start something at 64, with the kind of man I'd become, quieter than I used to be, less sure of things, carrying all that history that no new person could ever fully understand. That is the story I told myself, and I was so convincing. There was a man in the card group, Walter, who lost his wife about a year before I lost Carol. About 2 years after that dinner, Walter started seeing a woman named Patricia. He mentioned her casually one Thursday, the way you'd mention a change in weather. She was 67. She'd been widowed, too. They'd met at church, which Walter had started attending, not entirely for religious reasons, he admitted with a small smile. I watched Walter over the following months. Something in him changed, not dramatically. He wasn't giddy or transformed. He was just more present. He laughed more easily. He complained less about his knee. He started having opinions about restaurants again, because now there was someone to go to restaurants with. I remember watching him one night and thinking, that's nice for Walter. That's how far I had retreated. Not, I want that. Not, maybe that's possible for me, too. Just, that's nice for Walter. Like I was watching life from behind glass and simply accepted that the glass was there. I think what I didn't understand then, what I couldn't see because I was standing too close to it, was that I had made a quiet decision without ever consciously making it. Somewhere between that parking lot and that napkin and watching Walter and his Patricia, I had decided I was done. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony or clear moment of resignation. I had just stopped being available to possibility, to disruption, to the terrifying and ordinary work of letting someone into the specific, particular sadness of who I'd become. And the thing about that kind of decision, the quiet one, the one you never announce, is that it doesn't feel like a decision at all. It feels like realism. It feels like wisdom, even. You tell yourself you're being practical, that you're too old for that kind of upheaval, that you've had your love and it was real and whole, and asking for more would be greedy somehow, disloyal to what you had. You dress it up in very reasonable language, and no one argues with you because it all sounds so sensible. I'm not sure when I first understood what I'd actually done. It came slowly, the way cold comes into a room where a window has been left open. You don't notice it immediately. Then at some point you realize you're cold, and you've been cold for a while. I was 71. My son came to visit with Linda and their daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, who was 8 years old, and spoke with an absolute confidence about everything, from dinosaurs to the specific unfairness of bedtimes. I watched her at the dinner table one evening, and I felt something that I can only describe as a kind of mourning for my own certainty. There was a time when I'd been that certain. There was a time when I reached for things. I don't mean ambition. I mean simply there was a time when I saw something I wanted, and I moved towards it. Carol, the house we bought that was too expensive for us at the time, the job I asked for directly when I wasn't sure I was qualified. I had once been a person who moved towards things.
Somewhere in those 9 years since Carol died, I had become a person who watched. Sophie asked me at breakfast one morning, with absolutely no awareness of what she was asking, whether I got lonely. She was eating cereal. She wasn't looking at me. She'd asked it the way children ask things, directly, with no sense that the question might land somewhere complicated. I told her sometimes yes. She nodded like that was a perfectly acceptable answer and went back to her cereal. And I sat there with my coffee, and I thought, she's 8 years old, and she already understood something about my life that I had been carefully not understanding for nearly a decade. I think about the women I met in those years. Evelyn, obviously, the napkin. There was a woman named Dorothy who volunteered at the same library fundraiser I got roped into by my neighbor 3 years after Carol passed. We talked for 2 hours about a book we'd both read and a place we'd both visited years before, in a different life. And when I left, I thought I should have asked her to have coffee. Not romantically even,
Just to continue the conversation, I didn't. There was a woman named Miriam at my doctor's office. Not a patient, one of the administrative staff. She used to ask me how I was in a way that meant it. She was 68, 69. She had a photograph of grandchildren on her desk and reading glasses on a beaded chain. When she moved away, transferred to another office, I was told, I realized I'd never once asked her anything about herself. Not once. For 3 years she had asked how I was, and I had answered and moved on. I think about that. I think about how thoroughly I had closed myself, and how I decorated the closing with words like private and independent and content with my own company. I was none of those things. Not really. I was afraid. The fear wasn't what I would have expected. It wasn't fear of rejection exactly, though that was part of it. It was something older and harder to name. A fear of being known again, fully known, because being fully known by someone requires showing them the version of you that exists now, not the younger, more capable, more certain version, the current version, with all its diminishments and accommodations, and the particular way grief reshapes a person's interior. Carol knew me when I was strong in ways I no longer am, when I was sure of things I can no longer be sure of. She knew the version of me that hadn't yet experienced losing her. Anyone new would only ever know this version, and for a long time, far too long, that felt like something to hide from rather than simply offer. My son called me last winter just to talk. He does that now more than he used to. I think he started to understand things about time that he didn't at 40. He's 46 now. At some point in the conversation, he said carefully, gently, the way he says things he's been thinking about for a while. He said, "Dad, do you ever wish you'd tried a little harder to meet someone?" Not an accusation, just a question. He'd chosen the words slowly. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window. The light was doing what it does in January, thin and early leaving. I said, "Yes, I think I do." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I think Carol would have wanted that for you." I said I knew that. And I did know that. I had always known that. Carol was not the reason. I had borrowed her memory sometimes as a reason, the way you pull something off a shelf to hold on to when you're unsteady. But she was not the reason. I was the reason.
I don't know what my life would look like now if I had made different choices. I sit with that question sometimes, not with anguish anymore, more the way you might sit with an old map of a road you didn't take, not with fury, just with a kind of wondering. Maybe it wouldn't have worked.
Maybe Evelyn had found someone else by the time I could have called, and whatever might have begun there would have been brief or complicated, or not what either of us needed. Maybe Dorothy from the library and I would have had coffee and discovered we had nothing else in common beyond that one conversation. Maybe. But maybe is a door, and I spent 15 years making sure I never stood close enough to find out if it would open. What I understand now, in the particular clarity that comes when you're closer to the end than the middle, is that I confused protection with wisdom. I thought I was being careful with myself, guarding what was left, not risking the grief of another loss. But you can't guard yourself into a full life, and the losses I was protecting myself from, the imagined losses, the possible losses, they never came. What came instead was a different kind of loss, the quieter kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The loss of ordinary evenings with another person, the loss of being known, imperfectly and gradually, by someone who chose to know you, the loss of being in someone's thoughts on an average Tuesday. Those losses don't feel like losses when they're happening. They just feel like Tuesdays. I'm not a man who cries easily. I say that not as a point of pride. I understand now it was never actually something to be proud of, but just as a fact about myself. But there is one moment I return to, maybe more than any other, that gets close. It was 3 years ago. I was at a small restaurant near here, eating alone, which I do sometimes because the apartment can get to be too much. At a table near the window there was a couple, both of them clearly in their 70s. He had a hearing aid. She had a cane leaning against her chair. They were sharing something, a dessert, I think, and they were talking about something I couldn't hear, and at some point she said something and he laughed, really laughed, not performed, just genuinely, quietly delighted by her. I watched them for probably too long, not with envy exactly, or not only with envy, with something more like recognition, like seeing a photograph of a place you've been and suddenly missing it in a way you didn't know you still could. I thought that could have been possible for me, even at 64, even at 67, even at 70, maybe. I could have been that man. I'm telling this not because there is something to be done with it now. I'm telling it because I've kept it inside for a very long time, and it has taken up a great deal of room. I'm telling it because I think there are men, and women too, who are doing what I did without knowing they're doing it, moving carefully away from their own lives, calling it maturity, calling it not wanting to impose, calling it being realistic about their age, their situation, what they still have to offer. I'm not going to tell anyone what to do. That's not what this is. I just know what I did, and I know what it cost. And I know I'm sitting in this chair with furniture for 2 people and only one person's footsteps. And the quiet in here is not the peaceful kind. Carol would have been 76 this April. I think about her differently now than I used to, less like a wound, more like a presence that is simply part of what I am. She's in the way I make coffee, still exactly how she taught me. She's in a handful of phrases I use that were originally hers. She's in a kind of patience I learned from watching her that I hadn't had before we met. She's not a reason to have stayed closed. She never was. I think I knew that for a long time before I was willing to know it. If you're still watching, you don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for that. But if any part of this sat with you somewhere quiet, I suppose I'd just say sit with it a little longer.
That's all. I'm Harold. I'm 78 years old, and it got late faster than I thought it would.